So this video is about how to graph sine and cosine functions. So there's a few things you need to know first. Y equals the sine of x has a basic graph that looks like this. Okay. Now, the length from beginning to end is called the period. Okay. For sine, this is always 2 pi for one period, as long as there's nothing else weird in the equation. Then you've got this distance right here that's called the amplitude. Okay, amplitude is that word. That is the distance above and below this line right here that we're going to call the balance line. What goes up must come down. In order to keep that line straight, we've got to balance it above and below. So you can see that we've got a hump above, right up here, and then a hump below. Okay, and then we come back up. And with sine, we begin and we end in the same spot. The nice thing then is halfway in between, if we come halfway in between those two, that's going to be another center, or another 0. So here's 2 pi at the end of the period. Here's pi in the middle of the period. Everything's based on halfway. So from 0, our start, to pi, halfway in between those, is pi over 2, which happens to then have a maximum. And then halfway between pi and the pi over 2 is going to be 3 pi over 2, and that's going to have a minimum. It's not so important that you remember what these actual tick marks are, here, 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 and here, what their names are, because those are going to change as the period changes. What you need to make sure you remember and understand is the shape. So if it's a positive sine graph, it's going to follow this curve every time. If it's a negative sine graph, it changes a little bit. So if we go ahead and do, I'll use red, y equals negative sine of x, or if we have y equals sine of negative x, it really does the same thing that a parabola did. Okay, if you think back, a parabola, positive x squared, opened up. And then what happened when we changed it to y equals negative x squared? Hopefully you remember it opened down. So when you stuck this negative in front, right here, it flipped. It flips over the x-axis, or reflects is a better word. Okay. So if we graph that, we just take everything and do it in the opposite order. So instead of starting going up, we would actually start by coming down with our curve. Whoops, go down with our curve. Go back through that same, sorry, my pen's jumping, back through that same 0, and then we'd still end at that same 2 pi. Okay, it just flips upside down over that x-axis. All right, so that's your sine curve. The basic format of it with all the variables is y equals a sine of bx. And so we get our amplitude from the a, absolute value of a. You can use capital or lowercase. Actually, it really depends on the book you're using. So I guess I'll use a capital to stay consistent. So capital A is going to give you your amplitude. And then the period uses the b. And period is 2 pi over the absolute value of b. The b equals the number of periods in 2 pi. Okay, the number of periods in 2 pi. All right, so let's actually graph one with a little more meat to it. So let's say we have the equation y equals, this is an example, y equals 2 sine of 1/2 x. y equals 2 sine of 1/2 x. So your capital A, which gives you your amplitude, is going to be 2. So when we draw it and we have our balance line, we're going to make sure that we go up and down, and that up and down is going to be a distance of 2. Okay? The B is 1/2, so our period is 2 pi over 1/2, which gives us 4 pi. Remember, when you multiply by a fraction, it'd be 2 pi times, or divide by a fraction, you're multiplying by the reciprocal, so that gives us 4 pi. That's where that came from. Okay. Since we have a positive right here, that's a positive 2, so this starts up. Okay, your hump is going to be up above the balance line, and that's how I know that it's going to be that shape instead of coming down below. Remember, we would only come down below if it were negative. All right, so we have a positive, so we are going to go up above and then come down. Okay, so let's graph that. We'll do 2 periods. So on graph paper, I like to use 8 tick marks for 1 period. It just makes everything a lot easier. Because everything's based on a half. You have to cut it in half multiple times. Since I don't have graph paper here, I'm just going to come out and kind of eyeball. I'm going to come out to about the middle, and then I'm going to put right there my first period. My period is 4 pi, so I'm going to make that a 4 pi. And then I'm going to go about the same amount of space. I'm just going to eyeball it out because I don't have graph paper again. And so that one is going to be 8 pi. Okay. So then I'll go halfway between my start and my finish, and I'll mark that because that's a critical point, and that's going to be 2 pi. That's where our graph goes through that axis again. And then halfway between 0 and 2 pi, I have another important point. There's going to be a maximum. Okay, so let's start out by plotting. The first thing that you want to plot, if I were to make a list here, first, plot the beginning and end. And there should be 2 ends there, beginning and end, sorry. Second, we're going to plot halfway, and in this case, it's another 0. So I have my beginning, I have my end of the first period, and I have my 0 in the middle. Then I'm going to go halfway between these first two, between 0 and 2 pi. Okay, so third, do your maxes and mins. Okay, so our amplitude is 2, so here would be 2 up and 2 down. I need to know how high to put those maxes and mins. So halfway between 0 and 2 pi, I'm going to come up here and put my max because it was a positive sign. So start up in the positive spot. And then I come over here, and halfway between 2 pi and 4 pi, I'm going to put my minimum. So I now trace through those points, and I have my first period. Okay, so from here through is 1 period. All right. Now we need a second period, so we're going to do exactly the same thing. So for the second period, I'll change colors real quick. Let's get those tick marks. So halfway between 4 pi and 8 pi, so I need a halfway mark, and then I need half of each of those spaces. So basically you're dividing every period into fourths so that you can place these critical points. Okay, fourths for graphing. Okay, so let me go back and get my blue. So I'll start at 4 pi, I'll end at 8 pi, halfway between I put my 0, and I put exactly the same marks. So halfway between the first and the second mark, here at pi so that'd be at 5 pi. I go up to my maximum of 2. Halfway between 6 pi and 8 pi, I come down, and I have my minimum at -2. And then I trace through those. And there's how you graph a sine curve. Okay. Check out the video on how to graph a sine curve with shifts next.